And we're thankful to be back live in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Dr. MacArthur, on his short lessons in Genesis, only goes through like first 10, 11 chapters. He calls it the origin of origins. Think about that. So we're talking tonight more about the history of the New World. Because as we left, there was how many people left on the earth? 8 people. That was Noah and his wife, 3 sons and their wives, and were coming out, and we'll get that back up in a minute. But anyway, there was 8 people in the world. But tonight we're going to find out how the nations began as a result of the propagation, as Andy was talking about a while ago, of the world after what happened. We'll open with prayer and we'll get started. Father, we thank you for the absolute privilege it is to be in your house tonight. I certainly thank you for everyone who is here tonight, and I ask for a special blessing for people who have taken time to come tonight, that you would allow us to open our eyes to hear what you have to say, that as Dr. Will Graham said today, that I would get out of the way and let the Spirit speak through me. And let us walk through the open door that you give us tonight, and certainly I pray that you would use my mouth to let it be clear what you have to say tonight. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. We've made it to chapter 10, so we're about a fifth of the way through Genesis. And I don't know how far we'll get tonight, but you would think just going through chapter 10, and Bill gets the fun part of calling all these names out, you would think you just blow right through it. But some of these names we're going to read, if you're a prophecy buff, are going to know I've heard those names from Ezekiel and from Isaiah and Zechariah and Revelation. So I'm going to try to paint that picture, and then we'll hopefully get to the Tower of Babel tonight. But when we left, we went through the entire time of the 381 days that the ark was on the water. And they came out, and what was the first thing that Noah did from last week? Build an altar and sacrifice to the Lord. So we certainly remember. Debbie paid attention back there. The rest of it, either I go show bad teaching up there. But anyway. But they went out, and some time elapsed between the flood and the next event that we studied last week, and that was poor Noah drunk. He partook of the grapes. We don't know, well, we assume it was grapes, but it could have been any kind of fruit that had fermented. And he stripped off and was passed out. And remember, he had one of his sons saw him. Ham saw him, went and looked at him and kind of laughed, giggled, carried on out. He said there was all kinds of theories about it. Obviously, it was the wrong thing to do. And then Japheth and Shem backed up and covered him with a blanket so they didn't see it. And as a result, we're going to pick up, I'm going to read those before we move into 10 because it's important. As a result of that, there was some prophetic statements made by Noah. I'm going to look at verse 24 in chapter 9. And when Noah awaked from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan." Remember, Canaan is one of Ham's sons. Why was it Ham the one cursed? Dr. MacArthur says, because he was righteous. He sinned, but he was righteous. Because only 3 righteous people were saved. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Canaan is the one the curse went on to. He would be a servant of servants, shall he be to his brothers. Now here's the key that we're going to pick up on tonight. He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant, and may God enlarge Japheth." So we're going to spend the most of our time talking about Japheth and his descendants tonight. "And let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." That's going to be important. Put that in the back of your mind. So, with all that, it's a very important chapter that we're getting ready to read, because in this table of nations, and for those online following us, we've handed out a map of where all these descendants went. And it's amazing to see how the nations of the world came to people, Noah and his wife, and ultimately from their sons. And they would spread throughout the nations of the day. Genealogy is very popular these days. You can go and find a number of websites on the internet where you can trace your genealogy. The ultimate, when it comes to that, is the Mormon Church out in Salt Lake. They have really done a huge amount of research in determining, people's origins and all that. So certainly, it's out there. And This whole genealogical effort kind of could lead to, I got to read it because Dr. McCropper used it, a new generation or genre of bumper stickers. I think, like, my forefathers were Philistines, or Goliath was in my family, or I come from a long line of Hittites, or here's a good one, my ancestors killed your ancestors. You don't ever know what people would see, but one thing is certainly for sure is we can all say we descended from one person, Noah. Now we ultimately could say Adam, because remember, everybody was wiped out except for these ones, so we know we had to come from Noah. And so your bumper sticker could say, my family survived the great flood. Being a little sarcastic here, carrying on. But anyway, we know that there was 3 sons that came from that. And this chapter is what we call the Table of Nations. It's one of those things called a Toledo. Now, we talked about that earlier when we began looking at the different sections of Genesis, these Toledos, which means beginning or origins. We saw the origin of man. We've seen the origin of different things, and I'll break them down. This is another one of those beginnings, because before Bill reads, he's going to see it. It says, these are the generations of. So that means we are the origins and beginnings of stuff. So it's what we would call the Table of Nations, or the family nation. It's going to really trace the descent of mankind back through 3 sons of Noah. And certainly this genealogy would spill over into chapter 11, on the second part of that, but we're probably not going to get there tonight. And the important thing is really after 11, we follow the genealogy of Shem, because Shem is the ancestor of Abraham, and Abraham is the father of the Hebrew nation, which the rest of the book of Genesis is going to be there. Once we get into chapter 12, it's going to be nothing but what we call patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12, and everything. So that's kind of where we're going at with that. Well, human history goes a little bit like this. I'm going to read it before we get reading. Adam to Seth, to Enoch, to Methuselah, to Lamech, to Noah. So in 6 names, we go from Adam to Noah. Let me read those. Adam, Seth, remember not Abel, what happened to him? Cain, cursed, drowned. Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. They are the 6 names that take us from Adam to where we are at now. Now this is Noah's line. Adam, Seth, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. So if you want to trace your lineage back to Noah, we know it goes backwards from Noah, Lamech, Methuselah, Enoch, Seth. The whole human race really heads back that way. So, you cut beat to the shortness of it. So here you got Noah and his 3 sons is really what we call the second starting point of history. Because we had to go forth with Adam and Eve, and then the flood, and now we're really starting off again. So let's we'll break this down easily. So why don't we read 1 through 5 in chapter 10, Bill?
Okay. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashenkaz, Rephath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Odanim. From these coastland people spread in their lands, each with their own language, by their clans in their nations.
Well, we're going to stop right there. That's the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Certainly, God bless the reading and the exposition of His Word. See if we can make some heads or tails of these things. Now, is any of those names registered to anybody? No. Some of those names, if you study prophecy, especially if you're doing our Revelation study, some of those names ought to jump off the page.
Gomer,
Magog, and Tubal.
There you go. Now you're picking up on that. So, especially from Ezekiel. Well, the crucial man after Noah on the genealogical chart certainly is going to be Abraham. We're not going to get to him until, we won't have Bible study next week, so the following week, when we're introduced to a man named Abram, also named as Abraham. And we'll get into the importance of him, and he will begin to appear in chapter 11. And so between Noah and Abraham, we have this genealogical record, which is going to introduce us to the sons of Japheth, the sons of Ham, and then particularly and specifically down the stretch to Shem, because Abraham is going to come from Shem. And from Abraham comes the Jewish race, the Hebrews, the people of Israel, and ultimately Jesus the Messiah. So that's why there's so much emphasis on it. So when we get to Abraham, we're going to be focused on the line of redemptive history. And from Abraham, we know there's King David. From Abraham comes the Messiah and all of that stuff at once. So that's what we get to come with. But we have to get to Abraham first because we're still just a few months, years away from the flood. And it's very interesting genealogy as you go through this. And I thought we'd just blown through it. But when I listened to two or three of the different things, I said, we've got to go through this because this is so interesting to know where the sons ended up at because there's people today that have come from them. So, at the outset, we're going to begin to spend most of the time talking about the sons of Japheth. And what he does, the Lord gives us a little bit of history about it, and then clears us going. Now, this survey is selected, one of the commentaries. Not everybody that was ever born to him is named here. And it's certainly not what they call an exhaustive list. Not every person, not every family is named. Because, for example, there are some sons named of Japheth in verse 2, but only 2 of them are followed as their sons. And you know they had more than 2 sons. They probably had the old people say had a passive one. But anyway, it's selected. Now, that doesn't mean one's better than the other. These are just ones the Holy Spirit chose to put in here. There are 70 persons that are listed here. Now, some of them aren't just people. They're tribes and families and nations that are listed as part of that and came from that. So, it's really a witness to God blessing Noah because as we ended last week in chapter 9, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he told them one of the blessings that he was talking about before that he said was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole world. And that's what God did and commanded, and they began to do it. It's one of those words of Toledot, which I said means genealogy or generation. Some versions may have these are the records of it. We've seen that as we've seen it. This is the first one was the Toledot of the generation of Adam. That was back in chapter 5, verse 1. Chapter 6, verse 9 was the generations of Noah. And now we get in chapter 10 the generation of Shem, Ham, and David. So if you ever hear anybody start using these fancy words like Toledot, this means origin and beginning. So Genesis is going to be largely broken down by generations of different people. First of all, we had the heavens and the earth set up, and then Adam, and then Noah, and now we've got his 3 sons that are people who are coming on to the playing field, as we would say, in the sports world. Well, there are 3 sons, as we said, and they are the only 3 sons of Noah. Some people have said he had all these other sons. We don't know anybody else he had. Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Now, each of these 3 sections, and Bill has read the first section, has 3 categories in it. First, the son is listed. Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Secondly, the descendants of that son are going to be listed. That's where those other names come from. And thirdly, there's given a little summary concerning the offspring. So in each of the 3 sections, we have a son, a descendant, and a summary. And so with that background, this kind of get going forward. As I said, I had to skip over. We already talked about Noah and the curse and the little prophecy that came from it. So let me get over that. One of the other things that we said before we get sectioned is this actual genealogy we know is given ultimately down to Abraham. And if you follow the genealogy from Noah to Abraham, Noah probably lived almost to Abraham's life. Because he lived, what we say last week, he lived after the flood, he lived another 350 years. So we keep thinking, Adam had seen a lot of these people right up until he passed, because he lived 937 years? I can't remember what it was. And so he would have seen some of these people from that. And that Noah, writing to the children of Israel, would be writing to them so they would know their ancestry. And I love what Dr. MacArthur said in one of his commentaries. He says, I am indebted to a lot of these writers who helped me fill this genealogy. One of these guys is a guy named Dr. Henry Morse. Now, he must be a good writer because almost anybody in commentary on this goes back to Henry Morse's commentary on Genesis. So I know how to get my hands on that. That should be a very good to get on. So we're going to start with Japheth's line. I'll give us that background. Now the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, and Madai and Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. So we read all of them. From these, it says the coastlands were separated. So here are all the descendants. Now Japheth is mentioned first, and then his descendants. And then we said that last verse tells us a little summary. And all of this is assuming something. Something's getting ready to come up in the next chapter that's going to spread these people. The Tower of Babel. So it assumes that's getting ready to happen because remember, the people kind of hung together. Somebody had to drive them apart, and we know the Tower of Babel did it. So it's all mixed up, coming together. Now, let's talk about Japheth. Now, he's important to us because he's probably the line that we all came from. And I'm going to tell us why. He's the father of what we call the Indo-European nations. So if you got your map, you look at it. Japheth's descendants left, and remember, Israel is the center of the world in Bible time. And his descendants went west and east. North from Israel and west and stretched all the way to the east part of the things there. He's the father of those nations. Now, it was in the 19th century that it became clear that the languages of this area were all related in one aspect, requiring they all came from a common language ancestor. This is MacArthur deep. I'm going to try to make it come down to what we can understand. For centuries, people didn't make the connection between all these languages. Because you say, well, somebody from India is not really going to speak the same way from France or England. But there are some very similarities. And in the 19th century, they began to make the connection. One of the earliest languages that is at the base of both the Eastern and Western languages is a language that's been extinct for a long time. It's called Sanskrit. Almost sounds like, you'll know, that stuff that you put on, around your poles. Concrete, Sanskrit, that is right. This is very close to it. Linguistic students, even today, when they go to India to study Sanskrit, they go there because it's the closest language to the entire range of all languages. What that means is that it goes way back early on. It's the source of almost all different languages. And so, as I said, in the 19th century, they began to discover that. Now, Jeremiah says, if you have the MacArthur Study Guide, you can turn to that page and there's a map. Like I said online, I've given it, James and I provided a map that we printed off that really shows where all these people go. Now we're going to quote from the Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary stating what the Indo-European language means. Quote, it's the most important linguistic family of the globe. It comprises all the chief languages of Europe, together with the Indo-Iranian and other Asiatic tongues. In the 19th century, comparative and historical study of these languages, called also the Indo-Germanic and Aryan languages, established their descent from one common ancestor. And they say, spoken as far back as the late Stone Age. They say the language source probably was in Eastern Europe by a people or a group of people that were unknown, perhaps the mixed race. The prehistoric dialects of these primitive Indo-Europeans accompanied their migrations from that middle area of Europe into India, Persia, Greece, Rome, India, Greece, and Rome, where they were all found at the beginning of organized history. The parent speech was highly infected and historically a general tendency of the Indo-European languages to be French, English, and all that tied together. Now, all that means is they traced it back to the European area, but it spread everywhere. They had some common dialects and words that were used from it. In accompanying that, it says the family of these languages is divided into two types. The Eastern languages, involving the languages of India, Afghanistan, Iran, Armenia, the Balkans, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, parts of Germany, East Prussia, Lithuania, and Latvia, all have very similar speech. The Western division of the language, this is getting close to home now, were the beginning languages of Greece, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Romania, Cornwall, Wales, Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, parts of Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and England. So, all of our languages that we speak have some kind of origin from one ancestry that linguists have traced back, that spread as far from the Eastern Europe to the Western part of Europe. Now, the fact that the dictionary understands that comes from a common source, also gives us instant evidence to tell us where things trace themselves back. Well, the Greeks trace themselves back They traced their heritage back to a man named Japetos, Japeto, Japetos, a form of the word Japheth. And then you read about this man Japetos in the writings of Aristophanes. People in the East, the Indian, Persian, trace themselves back to a flood account with a man named Japhethai as their father. Japhethai, Japetos, Japheth. So they trace their language and their history back to a flood and a man named Japheth. Now, some of these people aren't what we would probably consider Christian people, but they trace their heritage back to a man named Japheth in their own language to the time of the flood. That puts goosebumps on me. I was like, I can't let this go by. This is so good. And so you go east, you go west, you find Japheth ultimately at the beginning of these languages. Now let's look at the text. In verse 2, we meet this guy named Gomer. Now, information from historian Herodias, Strabo, and Plutarch indicate that Gomer's people, now look at your map, settled north of the Black Sea. Now, if you see the Black Sea, that's right above where Russia area is. In an area called Samaria, or today it's called Crimea. We've heard that certainly word Crimea because it's right on the outskirts of Russia.
Crimean Sea.
Yep. So some of Japheth's ancestors settled north of the Black Sea where modern-day Crimea is. Let me get back to the place. The sons of Japheth also were called Gomer. He went north into the Black Sea area and even beyond it. Later he expanded into Europe, settled in France, later called the Gauls. Study that from history, the Gauls. They traced their ancestry back to Japheth. In Spain, they were called the Galicians. In Britain, they were called the Celts. In Wales, they were called the Sinew. All of these variations in these three continents come from Gomer that came from Japheth. So that's why I said most of us probably take our ancestry back to Europe, France, England, Germany, some of that area. So we probably are descendants from Japheth because our language and the people that settled were from that area. So Gomer settled in that area. Many of the linguistics connect the three consonants in linguistics with what we call the Cumberland umbrella, which is in Ireland and so forth. So that means that these people settled in the northwest part of Europe, of Gomer's. Now there's 6 other sons that are mentioned. One guy named Magog is mentioned. Anybody know where we find Magog at? He's in that area, but we're out in the Bible we discovered that. Revelation and Ezekiel.
Yeah.
He's in Ezekiel 38. He's symbolic of the end-time confederacy that comes to fight against the Messiah in the last days. Remember, he talks about that war of Gog and Magog. It's really hard to know exactly where Magog is exactly, but most of the interpretive history would say he went to the northern areas, and what is north of Israel? The Russian area.
Right.
It also could refer to the areas where people settled, known as the Scythians, Scythians. They went north and a little bit east. Many people associate these ancestors of Magog with the Mongols and the Huns. Remember those from the Roman history, who went east as well. Others say that the descendants of Magog were the people of Gog, another name we'll study, a familiar name from around the Caspian and the Black Sea, all modern-day Balkan states that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Josephus identifies Magog as the place where the people of God lived around the Caspian Sea. You've got your map there to see. That's the region of the southern Russia that we call today the Ukraine. Daily News. They are most likely descendants of Magog. Now, there are a couple of other sons. It's just interesting. You just couldn't blow past it. Somebody done the research on this. Then there are a couple of other sons named Tubal and Meshach. And we want to mention them because they were also people from the north. Like I said, anything you see north in the Bible, Israel's the center of the world. These ones are pretty easy to trace. We found some of these from the Assyrian monuments. Remember the Assyrians who came and pestered the Jewish people? The Assyrians were people to the north of Israel, And the Jewish people were always afraid that the Assyrians were going to come down and invade them. I think they had a guy that led them by the name of Sennacherib. Remember that name from your Old Testament? So, as we have found these things, when I say we talk about historians, they found some monuments among the Assyrian ruins identifying people called Mushkai or Mushku, which is a lot like Mishal. There's another people called Tubali and Tubali. They later show up on the Muscovy River near the city of, sounds very familiar. Let me say those words again. Mushi, Muskau, Mishal. What city sounds a lot like that today? Moscow. Some of these people trace their ancestry back to the current where Moscow is today. Some of these are found on the Muscovy River near the city of Moscow and the Tobol River near the city of Tobolsk, Russia today. There are several other cities in the Russian area today that have derivative names from Tubal and Meshach. So they're certainly associated with that, which would go to say later in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel says that the army coming from the north would make wise coming from Russia, which is used the name Rosh, which is a modern-day translation of Russia. Funny how it all ties together. So we see in Japheth, people went to Europe and that area. Verse 3, we meet another guy named Gomer. Now, I like to think of when you say Gomer on the pile, right? And what was
Circle cars are crazy.
Yeah, and gosh, who was that married Gomer? One of the prophets in the Old Testament. You know what I'm talking about?
Habakkuk.
Who was it?
Habakkuk.
Yeah, he married Gomer. So anyway. So now we meet some of the sons of Gomer.
No, it wasn't Habakkuk. It was Haggai.
Y'all look at, tell me who it is. It was one. He married her, and God used it as an example.
Yeah.
So we now meet some of the sons of Gomer. Now, not all the sons of Jacob have their names listed, but two of them do. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphah, I guess I'm saying right, and Togarmah. Now, Ashkenaz is traced to the north of Sedom, and his name is preserved in a place called Lake Ascanius. As to the people of that area, are so called in ancient writings of Homer and Ascanius. So Homer and his writings make reference to these people, which were certainly derivatives that came from Ashkenaz. They later moved to Germany, so that the Jews in Germany were later known as Ashkenazi Jews during that time period. And so people that are Jewish could probably trace their history back to the Lake Ascanius area, in the Germany area. Who was it? Hosea. Yeah, it was Hosea that married Gomer.
I knew it was sort of name.
So most likely Gomer's Ashkenaz people settled in what would be modern-day Germany today. Then there is Riphah, that's very hard to trace. Josephus says in his Antiquities that he was the father of the Paphlagonians. And we don't know what happened to them. They got mixed up. Anyway. Togarmah is very interesting. That's another name that you'll find in Ezekiel. He was the direct ancestor of the Armenians. We know that name. And certainly we know there's a lot of Armenian different churches in the world. And probably there are people that, if you know the Armenians, know that they trace some of their background to the house of Targum. And it is literally that area that identifies with the Armenians, with key places like Turkey, Turkestan, and Targum. So you see this area where they translate. So we're talking this whole area where they left north to the west. Now, it's very hard to be exact about these. There's, these migrating people, they moved, but all agree that his people went north and west. And when we find these words that are alike, we say these words sound alike, and they all can trace their language back to a similar language of Megog, Meshach, Tubal, Ashkenaz, Rophah, and Togarmah. They're all in the same area, in this area that we look at here. So, we've seen now, we've talked about, remember, some of them went to the west, some of them went to the east. So let's do the remember it says Indo-European part? Let's talk about that. We look at a third son named Madai, M-A-D-A-I. The root of the ancient Medes trace their history back to Magog. Now we know that the Medes would join the Persians to set up the Medo-Persian Empire that came in after the fall of Babylon. Remember Daniel? Lois Lynn always wants to study Daniel. Daniel saw the vision of the gold head with Babylon, and then he saw the silver, which was a new kingdom that was coming on that would be run by the Medo-Persians. These people trace their roots back to Madai, and they lived in what we call Persia, which is modern-day Iran. Later moved into India and were part of that empire that set itself up. Well, back into verse 2, we see there was another guy named Javan. He was the fourth son of Japheth. Very interesting. He was the father of what they call the Greek peoples. Javan. In fact, when we think of Greeks, these people belong to various families. The Hellenes, the Ionians, the Arcanians, and the Dorians. But to the ancient people of the East, the Javan, they were known by only one name, Javan or Ionian. From that area, we get the word to speak the Hellenistic language, which is the Greek language. So these people must have settled somewhere in the Greek area that wrote that, and then of course we get Hellenist as a derivative from it. If you look at verse 4, we see another guy named Elisha, E-L-I-S-H-A. That's shocked, right? He was one of the sons of this guy Javan. And so you have in Javan, he's an Ionian, which is the most generic term for the Greeks. And then the Greek generic term for the Greek is Helios, that's associated with Elisha. So all these people seem to settle down in the Greek area, which now we see as a derivative of the Hellenistic language, which is Greek. And we know Greek's important because a lot of the Old Testament was written in Greek and then translated into Hebrew and translated in English. If I'm not mistaken, I think the old King James comes from the Greek. And so then you have a place called Tarshish listed there as another another guy as a son of Javan. His name is Tarshish. Does that name ring a bell to anybody?
Jonah.
Tarshish is a city, and we know that somebody ran there.
Yeah, Paul Thompson.
And somebody else went there to try to escape from somebody.
Jonah.
Jonah. Jonah the whole boogie away from where he needed to go. He was trying to escape the Tarshish from the God. So we see that, this is someplace that's Tarshish. Well, then he had some sons, from which the Kittian and the Dodanians come from. I don't know anything about that. I just got it written down here. Most of these people are associated with Cyprus and Rhodanium, or Rhodes area, R-H-O-D-E-S. So we see now people are a little bit to the south and the east, with the exception of Javan, who's in the west. But let's go back to the east. We talked about the Medes, the Modi, from that area. We see that these people settled there, and it says they separated into the lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, to their nations. And that's certainly why I said we went back and read it. What was the prophecy of Noah? Now, he didn't say it to Ham or Shem that their territory would be what? Enlarged. Jacob certainly enlarged, because we've seen it. It's ranged all the way from England in the east, west, to India and these areas in the west. So Jacob certainly went and took over the whole area. Now let's see. That's what he says. For most of us who come from European stock, most likely came from Jacob, because our forefathers are in Europe, certainly descendants of Jacob. Even those who came from Russia, even those who came across the Persia and India, it's believed they all migrated from this area and all are descendants of Jacob, which very possibly crossed the Bering Strait from Russia, across down into Alaska, and came down through Canada to North and South America. So certainly, most likely, most everybody that we are, even the native Indians and stuff, would have probably traced their ancestry back to Jacob, because he went and enlarged the entire world. So I think we've squeezed about all that we can find out that a huge portion of the earth, and why we spent more time on it, really came from Japheth, because that was Noah's prophecy that Japheth's territory would be enlarged. Well, very quickly, we're going to spend less time on these ones because there's less we know about it. Let's read from 6 to 20 about Ham. We talked about Japheth. Unless anybody has any questions on it. I went too fast. It was interesting to know, to me, where all these people settled.
The sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabekta. The sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Egypt fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphutahim, Patrushim, Kalushim, from whom the Philistines came, and Captorim. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterward, the clans of the Canaanites dispersed, and the territory of the Canaanites extend from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations.
Well, I'll stop right there. He did a heck of a good job on that, didn't he? Woo, yes. Ain't you glad you all didn't volunteer reading?
I couldn't do it.
I couldn't either. So we get now, we look at the Hamite flow. These Cush, Merizim, Put, and Canaan. Now these names ring a bell, right? Some of these do. Cush has 5 sons and 2 grandsons from Ramah, named Sheba and Dedan. You will see those if you study Ezekiel. 7 names associated in verses 13 and 14 are really families, not individuals. The Mizrahims. Anytime you see the isms and iams and ites, that means they were people, not just individuals. So we don't get as many of his individuals as we do family people from us. But Ham had 4 sons, and from Cush came 5 sons, 2 grandsons. Cush became the father of a man named Nimrod. Now stick that in your mind, because if I can get through this chapter, we're going to move into the first part and talk about Nimrod. He's important, and I talked about him Sunday morning. We talked about globalization, because he was the first globalist. So we'll talk about that. And from Mizraim came in the isms. So we've got a couple of things. Cush, anybody know where Cush is? Look at your map.
Isn't it in Afghanistan?
It's close to that. It's the Bible's name for Ethiopia.
Yeah, the 2 women.
So Ham's people went south. Remember, Israel's the center of the world. And we have to conclude that, anyway, by process of elimination, if the Japheths went east and west, who populated the African area? Who populated the southern parts of the Middle East and the east of that? And Cush is the name for Ethiopia. So it seems like that most likely Ham's people went south to that area. Now, Nimrod, we talked about him, who was the son of Cush, built his empire in what we call the Mesopotamian Valley. Remember that from your world history, which is directly east of Israel, known for its Fertile Crescent and the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Names that are very familiar. So all the sons of Cush seem to go west and south. If you look at the sons of Cush in verse 7, I'm going to read some of those. I'm not going to read all those, but all those names can be identified places in what we call Arabia. Mizraim is Egypt. In verse 13, where Mizraim is indicated, it says the people who came out of him went to the Egypt area. Put, in modern day world, is Libya. Now, a few years ago, Libya was in the news. So that's the North African area. It's a little bit west of Egypt. And then, of course, Canaan, we know, the 4th son, was the ancestor of all those tribes that settled in modern-day Israel. And Moses took them in, or Joshua took them into the Promised Land and had to drive all these people out. And these were the people who were there. The Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemamites, the Happathites, and all of those ites that were in the area at that time. And what was it? Somebody said the termites.
Yeah.
So the Canaanites were people who descended from Canaan. And there were all kinds of families in that area, and they had to be driven out when the Jews took over. Now, the Hittites are an interesting people. They had a little sort of life of their own. I love it, McCarthy. I just couldn't jump over this. They had an empire of their own, which today ultimately is in the area of modern Turkey area. At the time of Abraham, they were living in Canaan, and they were a very powerful people, and they were still a powerful people 1,000 years after Abraham, during the times of Solomon. He had do it. So these are the people that were the Hittites that were living there, and then when they were driven out, it seemed to end up down in the area of where modern Turkey's at. All right, we said, okay, we've talked about, pretty much Europe and Americas and all that stuff, and we know that the African area seems to be from Ham. But how about the people from China and Japan, the east, real far east of them? Who do you think probably was the ones who settled there? What about the Oriental people? Because we may have friends and family that are of Asian descent. Did the Japheths get to China? Did the Japheths get to Japan? Yes, anybody guess? No, I wouldn't guess it. It doesn't seem that the Japhethites made it there. Most of the evidence connects the heritage of the Asian people to the descendants of Ham. Perhaps the Hittites who came out of Ham were the ones who populated the Chinese area as a result of not only even Turkey, but let me read you through on this thought. The Hittite Empire endured for a very long time, over 1,000 years, and there are indicators of some of the Hittites fled to modern-day China area. I'll get the paper here together. The modern-day area of China. And then they migrated, a lot of them migrated down there on a route which somebody took when he opened a new area of commerce many centuries later. Youngers get in the swimming pool and they say it loud as they can say it. Marco Polo. You ever heard kids in the pool saying, Marco Polo? So there are indicators there were survivors of the Hittite Empire that left Turkey, fled into China, along the migrating route that Marco Polo took when he opened a new area of commerce with the east and the west. Same route they went there. Some also say it's the Hittites who got the name Shittai, which is the early name of Cathay, which means the Orient. So it seems that Ham's ancestors through the Hittites are the ones who followed the trade route and ended up into modern-day China. Many archaeologists say that the Hittites and the Mongols that are in modern-day, you remember they built that wall to keep the Mongols out of China, that's why there's a great wall there, have very similar features. Shoes which had toes that turned up, hairs and pigtails, pioneer work in smelting and casting iron, and the domestication of horses. They all share a common thread. So it very well could be that the Hittites, ancestors of Ham, settled China, Japan, and that area. Another possibility of that origin being from that way is that they are all use the word Sinites. When we get to the word Sino-American relations, which means dealing with China, which all comes from that area. Amazing. But this is the best thing ever. I can't leave Ham and get in before I go through this. Dr. McCarthy said he has a friend who's a Chinese scholar that goes to his church, and he gave me lessons in the Chinese language and its history. And the Chinese language traces its history back throughout the book of Genesis. It shows how the Chinese letters are actually pictures. Because if you've ever seen Chinese writing, not like theirs, they're like little picture frames. And Chinese letters are really pictures, and it proved the connection. They have words that are connected that demonstrate the pictures of the Garden of Eden, the serpent, the tree in the garden, Adam and Eve, and the whole thing. So a lot of their language pictures trace their pictures back to the book of Genesis. One of those that's very interesting, he said, I discovered, is the Chinese word for ship. So if there was a Chinese person here, and they wrote it, here's what the picture would look like. It's not really a word, it's a figure. The Chinese figure for a ship is made of 3 components. I have a little board, I would have drawn it for you. Component number 1 is like a container. Component number 2 is a person. And they depict the person by a mouth that's open. What do? We recognize people with what they say. So we've got a container, a person, And these three, and what's the third piece then? Okay, and the other sign for is the number 8. So these figures all pressed together for the sign of a ship is a container, a person, and the number 8. How many people were in the ark? 8 people. That is amazing. So if you were to, if somebody would write Chinese language up here, it would be the picture of a container, a person's mouth, and the number 8. And it all traces it back to a ship with 8 people. Wow. So somebody must have celebrated there, and most likely it was people from Ham's line. Just a brief moment as we move on to a child of Cush named Nimrod. It says he became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. It was said that people would compare, like Nimrod, they were a mighty hunter. If you wanted to say someone was powerful in that day, you say they were a lot like Nimrod. He was the prototypical powerful guy, and he was the beginning of a kingdom. This is the first time we see of a kingdom set up. It's called Babel. Now, we get that little I got that Spanish stuff that I worked on for Babel. And now we are finally introduced to this idea of Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and the land of Shinar. And from that land we go forth into Assyria, and he built this place called Nineveh. Does that place sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Somebody was sent to Nineveh to preach. Jonah. Good old Jonah. And he all moved in the opposite direction of Tarshish. So it all really ties together. So there's a little interlude here. In the middle of this genealogy of Ham, and the flow of families, we're introduced to this Nimrod person. And so he's very important because this is the first time in the world that we hear the word kingdom being used. There had never been a kingdom before, and the beginning of his kingdom was a kingdom that's going to play out for the rest of our time. Babylon. He was the world's first king and set up the world's first empire. Even the Lord recognized his power because in verse 9 it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and it was said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So even the Lord knows how strong and powerful this man had got. So he was the first great king who built the first world empire. And we're going to find out in a few minutes, if I can get us into it, that this world empire called Babel became very idolatrous and had to be done away with. So I said, if you go back and listen to Sunday's lesson on globalization on Sunday school, he was the first globalist. He wanted to set up a kingdom. From him, we've had Nebuchadnezzar, we've had Darius, and all these people that have come through the ages. Antichrist, they come from it. Certainly. But when he says he was a mighty hunter, it doesn't mean he was a hunter of animals. He was a killer. It should be translated a mighty warrior. He was a soldier. He was great and powerful. And so we know that Nimrod built Babel. Later on, if you study Daniel, you see Nebuchadnezzar, who was a Nimrod-like man, built Babylon. And we're going to find out, if you study in Revelation, that Antichrist is going to rebuild the final Babylon. And all was certainly destroyed. It was all in this area that Bill read a while ago, this valley of Shinar, which is Babylon, which is right outside of Baghdad today. That's where the world is playing itself out. And so we've now very seemingly met as much as we know about the sons of Japheth and the sons of Ham. Very quickly. Let's go 21 to the end of the chapter, Bill, and we'll talk a little bit about Shem, because we're going to talk a lot about Shem when we move through chapter 12 in 2 weeks.
To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. The sons of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gezer, and Mash. Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan fathered Almadad, Shelpheth, Azmarethbeth, Jerah, Adoram, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. The territory in which they lived extended from Misha in the direction of Sephar to the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood.
That pretty much sums it up. You see, this is what, remember, the last time we left, there was 8 people left on earth. Now we see these generations that have spread out. And now we come to the sons of Shem. Now, Shem was not the youngest. He's not just the last. He's probably the oldest. And also to Shem, we see he's the father of Eber. Now, in verses 22, let me get my place here. When you get to verse 21, we met Shem, who's the father of all these the children of what he calls Eber. This is the first reference to a word that we use all the time. Hebrew. Hebrew is from Shem that all the Jewish people come. So it's from Shem that comes all the sons of Eber, who gave the name Hebrew to God's chosen people. So this is where they get their name Hebrew from, Eber, who was the son of Shem. That's why he's in here. Now verses 22 follows the list of Shem. They all settled in the Middle Eastern area. Lud, mentioned in verse 22, was the furthest north. He settled up by the Black Sea. Havilah, Ophir, Sheba, and several others moved down to the further south area. They moved all the way down, literally, all the way down to the Gulf of Aden on the tip of the Red Sea. So you see, these are in the area what we call the Promised Land today. So they stretch really from the Middle East, from north to south, all the way, Lud in the north, all the way to Havilah, Ophir. And remember the Ophir? That's a place in the Old Testament. The gold of Ophir that we thought you'd read in the Old Testament. Where it was from. In the south and the rest. So the bulk of them all settled in the Canaan, Israel area. That's modern day Palestine, we would say. Just a couple of them are mentioned that we're going to talk about. Elam is mentioned in verse 22. He's the father of the Elamites. There was a king that we will find out sometime in the end of July maybe, in Genesis 14. And I'm going to butcher this name, named Chedorlaomer. 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 We will see him in Genesis 14. Remember him? The king of Elam had invaded Canaan, so that the son of Canaan served the sons of Shem. They didn't want to. But all during that time period, we meet another guy who's coming back named Melchizedek. During that time period, he was a Shemite, Shelamite, a Semite who conquered the Canaanites in that chapter. So we'll study that in a couple of weeks. Among the allies of Chedorlaomer was this title king named Goim, and these were the coastal people that were on that area there. So we see they were probably just didn't stay in one area; they stretched out all in the Palestinian area. The Elamites lived east of Mesopotamia. They had as their capital a little place called Susa. Anybody know that plays itself out in the Old Testament? Esther. She was taken captive to the capital of Susa. So the Elamites settled in a place called Susa. You know that Asher was the father of the Assyrian people, who we saw were conquered by Nimrod. They became a very racially mixed people. You have the name Arpachshad, or Arpachshad. He is going to be in the direct lineage of Abraham, we'll see. We'll see over in chapter 11. We'll see that. There's a guy named Lud, who's the father of the Lydians. Aram, who's the father of the Armenians, or the Syrians. That name plays familiar today. And they play a major role in Jewish history, and even today, we know where the Syrians are at. And by the way, it was the Iranians, who developed a language that we read sometimes called Aramaic, which 2 books of the Bible have it written in it. Daniel and Ezra. Then there was another sentence of the sons of Aram. There's a place called Uz. You know who lived in Uz? Al Cook nailed it. That's where Joseph from. So, these are important people. We don't know a whole lot about them, we just kind of know where they were at. One more, okay? There's one in verse 25. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of one was Peleg. And it says, for in his days the earth was divided. Now, what does that mean? Peleg means divided. and divided for one reason. What we're getting ready to turn the book chapter and read about. Tower of Babel.
Yep.
So Eber seemed to be living and was a contemporary of Nimrod. So Babel was built with its tower in Eber's lifetime, and Eber named his son Peleg the vision when he saw what God did to Babel. It's all tying together. Amazing. I couldn't blow this off. This is just, somebody done the research. We all needed to hear it. And we'll see that story over in 11th chapter. So Eber, whose name comes from the word Hebrew, named his son when the earth was divided during the time of Babel. Wow. Well, the rest of these names stretch the children of Shem, the Semites, all across the Middle East, from the Black Sea in the north to the Red Sea, all the way down. It's extensive people who settled in all these areas. Ham settles the south, Africa, and the Asian area. Japheth settles the north, Europe and into the northeast, Persia and India, and Shem seemed to stay right around the Canaan area in the Middle East. Verse 31 says, all the sons of Shem according to the families, according to the language by their lands. 26 families are listed from Shem, 30 from Ham, 14 from Japheth, totaling 70 different people. One name was mentioned there, I throw in when he read it a while ago. They were the father of the David had a heck of a time dealing with Philistines.
Yeah.
They were put in parentheses there to explain to the Jews who were reading. So what is this story really all about? Certainly talking about how man fell and how fast. We saw an earth completely wiped out, 8 people come from it, and as a result, we got people spread out all over the world doing their own thing. Some doing the right thing, some not. But certainly God's people are spread all out the earth. Well, as a result of what they did, let's read one more little section here in the chapter 11. Let's read the first 9 verses. And this should be familiar to all Sunday school-like people. Chapter 11, 1 through 9.
Okay. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there all over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth.
We'll stop right there. And that's why I've got to study Spanish so I can learn it. So from Moses' statement in chapter 10:25, we conclude that now God, during the days of Peleg, established an inheritance for each and every one of Noah's sons and their descendants. God had set these locational boundaries for each family line to live in. But as we move here into this text, we see that the people didn't obey God and moved to their specific habitational places that God appointed, probably convinced by that guy we just talked about, Nimrod, and he talks them into this building this huge city and some type of tower in a form of rebellion against God, and as a result, God had produced another judgment against her. We knew he wasn't going to flood it anymore, right? We saw a rainbow coming in tonight. So God had now separated the nations into these various geographical locations, but instead of going to where the Lord wanted them, He wanted, I don't know, maybe Bill to go over to Russia, and Willie to move to Mexico, and Audrey to Canada. But no, they all decided. Nimrod said, let's all get together. Let's make a one world government. Let's make a one world religion. Let's be ecumenism. Sounds like a one world order. You know, as I said Sunday, Nimrod was the beginning of his movement toward globalization. And no other president we've ever had pursued it more than George H. Bush. Yeah. He had that great speech about setting up the New World Order back in the early 90s. So it was a movement that still seemed its places. Here we are into the modern day of coming together. Let's all get together. It began as far back as this time in Nimrod's time. It became the first leader, and instead of going and celebrating their own places, they decided we'll stay together because we're strength and unity, right? Well, had God allowed them to remain together, we know they would have deteriorated into a level of wickedness that, because one rotten apple was full of whole bunch, right? We got one and leave it here.
Rodney, I always heard like they were trying to build a tower to go to heaven, and God confounded them because you can't get to heaven on your own works.
You're right. Yep. You're absolutely right.
So that's the way I always heard that, is that you're trying to get to heaven with your own works reaching, but that's not the way you're going to get.
Yep. So if you're not going to go there willingly, I'm going to send you there. And that's pretty much what this section is. The first observation was there was a unity of the people. So the Hebrew words, language, and words indicates that there was an incredible verbal unity that existed both in dialect and in words during this time period. I mean, we're all descendants from Ham, Shem, and Japheth, so they spoke the same language and the same dialect. So it was easy that, people say, well, I can't understand nothing you down there say. We say, we can't understand what you come down here and say, right? But these people had a verbal unity that everybody understood. And people spoke the same language, but everything is the same. So the tragedy is then that using that speech to exalt and glorify God, they were beginning to glorify themselves. The second thing is the location of this. This text is very explicit where this episode occurred, in the land of Shinar, which it immediately tells us whose domain are we in. We just talked about in my chapter. Nimrod. The Nimrod is set in this area. Now, Shinar is the Old Testament name for the plain that existed between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. So if you got your maps, you know exactly what is that. In ancient times, this land was known as Babylonia. This area had very critical prophetic implications because we know many Jews will come out of this area at the second coming of Christ. Isaiah 11:1 tells us that. The modern day for this area is called Mesopotamia, which is bordered on the south by this country all know of, Kuwait, on the west by Iraq, and on the east by Iran. So when you consider this focus, things are always seem to be happening around the land of Shinar. Well, what were they doing? Verse 3 tells us they were heading in the direction of having an accomplishment. Dr. Alan Ross, in his comments, says these people were an ingenious lot. The Hebrew word that they used for it was brick. Now, verse 3, see, and they said, come, let us make bricks, the ESV says. So they were making these bricks from a white chalky clay, which had a white color to it. So they were taking these bricks and baking them, and they looked white. And they put something like tar, an oil-like pitch liquid that hardened by the sun that kept them together. The English name that we know today that substance comes from, does anybody know? You wrote here on it, they come asphalt. Yeah. So they were hardening asphalt, putting bricks together and putting them together by asphalt. And that's kind of hard, right? There are very deep deposits of these things near the Dead Sea in this area. So they were making this huge building, baking these bricks, putting them together with a white color and putting them. So you probably was white and dark around it. My asphalt's usually dark. Well, what were they wanting to do? In verse 4, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower, as Terry said, with its tops into the heavens. So they wanted to build this huge city and this tower. Now, the word city refers to a strong, fortified place. They want this big place. We're all going to come together in this place, in this fortified place, and we're going to build a tower that was known for its height. It has been discovered in the Mesopotamia area. There are a number of what we call ziggurats. Remember that in history? They were like big, lofty, pyramidal towers that towered into the sky. Dr. S. Johnson says the ziggurats were like a stepped pyramid. Can't get smaller at all. The edifice being about the height of a modern 28-story building. Hey, I mean, think about these. They didn't have cranes and stuff. I mean, it's amazing. And on the top, usually with an altar built on the top layer, a kind of shrine about which were written the signs of the zodiac on the very top. So thus the tower was going to be a religious building. So they had a huge tower and were built up on the top. They had these religious symbols of the zodiac on them. The people wanted this tower to make a statement that they could accomplish whatever they wanted, and Terry hit it right on the head, including they could make their own way to heaven. Had to be Nimrod or running together. Said, come on, let's get together. We want to work our way to heaven. Remember, he's the grandson of Noah. Great-grandson. So they were wanting to make their way to heaven. They wanted to build a name for themselves. Notice in verse 4 it says, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves. God is our picture. They want to do this themselves. And they wanted to do it together. The desire to stay together in a unified attempt to stand against the will of God. Dr. Leopold, in his commentary, says, this world breeds defiance against God. So you see your first world movement towards globalization, all tied together, was Nimrod lead this group together. We're going to work our way to heaven. We're going to do it together, and we can have strength in numbers. We'll come together and we're going to work our way to heaven. Well, if we keep in mind that the goal was to build this tower to heaven, then read the opening of verse 5. And the Lord came down. I mean, it was bad enough that the Lord just didn't hit me. He could have. He came down.
That's interesting.
That
Worded like that.
It jumped out at you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the Lord came down. We see this accomplishment, man, was nothing more than God's honor, not like ants for him, but it was enough, serious enough that God came down. So think about it. Just 5 generations before this, God had destroyed this whole world by flood. Because it had reached a total, what he said, every intent of the thought of evil. And now it was heading in the same direction again. And these are come from righteous people. Because all the unrighteous was wiped out. It's the 3 righteous. But hey, goes to show you, as somebody once said, God doesn't have any grandchildren, right? God has every right. He could have very well done it, but what did he say? I'm going to see the rainbow, and I'm not going to do it. And so the last thing we see in the last section is the judgment of God. And God's solution, I'm going to confuse your language. So therefore, we all got to study books to start with that language. Now, the word confused means God mixed up your speech so you couldn't understand it. So all of a sudden, when Audrey and Cheryl back there were, well, let's go down and pick up a few bricks and put it up there. Audrey's like, what? What's
They
she
call
saying?
it Babel.
What's the purpose of doing all the different languages?
The confusion.
Because God said there would be nothing restrained from them because they were in one accord.
Is that why we all speak different languages now?
This is why we all speak different. Why I got to study Babel, and Rosetta Stone to be able to speak Spanish.
And people who were born speaking Spanish, if they know you're trying to learn Spanish, they go that much faster when they're talking.
Yeah. That's why we got French and Spanish and Italian and Russian and English. And think about it, even in the English language, we've got English and Old English and all the different things. So God confused it. So, like I said, when Lois and Cheryl and Audrey are going to try to do something, the minute Audrey opens her mouth, Lois says, what in the world are you saying? And she looks at Cheryl and says, can you understand? And Cheryl says, well, I can't understand what you're saying.
Well, it says the reason right in verse 6, it says, behold, the people are one, and they have one language, and this that they begin to do, now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. So let us go down and confound the language, because they were in one accord.
They were all, remember, they spoke all the same language and dialect, and they were going to try to come together, follow Nimrod, and set up this kingdom, take over and do what they need to do. And God says, I'm not going to kill you, I'm going to judge you, and we're going to speak language, so you can't work together.
I
And
bet
it's
the
hard
first couple of
sometimes.
days were fun. I mean, not funny, but
Well, even
they
if
were just
you,
dumbfounded. They're like,
even just being able to speak some Spanish, there's people that come in there. There's some people that speak Spanish. I can carry on a conversation with them. They're understanding. And there's some that speak Spanish that what different dialects of the Spanish. And same with France and whatever else language. And you can't understand somebody if you can't speak the language. Other than I'll say dinero, you know. But you know.
That's why a lot of people can't understand us coming from down here, old English, we call it.
Right. And it all comes back to this section. So the ability to understand certainly is a gift from God, and God at any minute confused it to the point, and so He did it. And He said, therefore this name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. And today that's why the ancestors of all these people are where we're at. In 2 weeks, we will pick up with Shem, more of Shem's descendants, with a particular focus on Terah. You know who Terah was?
no, Abraham's father or grandfather.
Father. And from him we're going to meet 2 guys that's going to be with us for a while. Abraham and Lot. But that's where we're going. So we'll get with it. That's where we're heading. We'll pick back up.
You said 2 weeks.
No study next week because Bible school will be running here.
Okay.
Let's go back to verse 7.
Go back to verse 7.
My Bible has us capitalized. Is this the first reference to the Trinity?
It would be the second.
Second reference.
Because the other was, remember, that was at the beginning. So they created.
Yes. So this
Yes.
is another reference to the Trinity.
Yep.
And what verse is it?
Verse 7.
11 said.
Come, let us go down and confuse the language. Everybody have that same in their version? So, yep, could pick it up. Anything else, anybody that we skipped over, or I'm in left field? I mean, we could have shot through that other section, but I just thought it was so amazing to know that somebody obviously researched to show where all these different ancestors went. And still today, you know, they trace some of the language back there. And the thing about China was just amazing. Because you don't really think of Chinese as being, you know, really biblically based.
7 would be the reference when somebody wants to say there's Jesus is not in the Old Testament.
Yep. Anything else? Really?
For Abraham was, I am.
You're right. You'll see that.
I wonder sometimes how it was back then. You know, when the Lord led Noah to build the ark, it was so high above the mountains. He had to provide the oxygen they needed because it was up in the air. But we speak of today. My mother used to get sick when Dad was doing newlyweds living in North Greenville, South Carolina mountains. And then I think about this right here. The Lord just left them alone. It got high enough that, hey, we can't do this anymore. He had to do them a favor, I guess.
Yep.
Unless the percentage has changed.
Probably not.
Yes.
What does Solomon say? Nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. But I know when they were in that boat, that far above, you know, the Lord provides.
I heard that the air quality came.
Yeah, we said last week when he came out of the ark, he was looking at a totally different world. Everything had been wiped out. Gushing water and all that. Been underwater for 300 and I can't remember how many days was it? 300 something days, right?
384.
384 or something like that.
When they built the Brooklyn Bridge, I know you guys probably read this before, the people got the pins. They didn't realize this stuff got so deep down there, going down.
So when we meet again, we will really start what we call the patriarchs. I mean, I've seen lessons that people have got with the patriarchs. We're going to start with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, what do they call him? He's a trickster. Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael, will be the 12 sons, and then ultimately conclude with Joseph. So, I mean, we've done 11 chapters from the creation of the world to the Tower of Babel, and then from 12 chapters, which is, what's 12 minus 50? 38?
Yeah.
38 chapters on Jewish people. God must have a special place for that. So. Anything else before we close? Who would have said we could have got that much out of a lesson from genealogy, but I couldn't let it go. Let's pray. Father, once again, thank you for just the privilege to study your word, personally for the privilege of being an expositor of your word. Lord, who would have thought that we could take such knowledge from a list of people in your word? But we've seen that we've gone from 8 people from the ark now to an entire world trying to conglomerate themselves to work their way to you, and certainly you dispersed it, and we're still living in that word. That they have to learn different languages and different cultures and all that as a result of this Tower of Babel. But we know it's all heading towards your chosen people that we will choose the next time we meet. We see the call of Abraham and all of the stories of that man of faith and the ancestry that leads to the line your son would come from. We ask that you continue to help us to hear and understand what your word tells us, from the minute words and the tedious genealogies to the exciting sacrifices and all the things that are to come in this book. Thank you for the privilege it is to teach it. Thank you for everyone who came tonight who could have been anywhere else in the world but chose to come and study your word. And I ask that you bless each person who did it. Certainly a blessing for the food in the back, and certainly for everything you give us, all the blessings and the faithfulness you show us. We ask all these things in Jesus' name, because you know you love us. You always have, and always will. Amen.